In order to present the practical benefits of using Speed Syntan SBS technology, Ecopal SA made an experiment, a comparative analysis of the quality and efficiency of products manufactured using Speed Syntan SBS technology and ordinary products. The first phase of the experiment was to compare the speed and quality of priming the substrate with C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS compared with an ordinary priming agent. The roofer's task was to correctly prime two substrate areas of the same size. A clear difference in the quality and the speed of work can be seen after just 10 meters of primer application. C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS spreads more quickly and easily and creates a smoother surface than an ordinary priming agent. It is worth pointing out that an ordinary primer is more shiny and thick, meaning that it does not prime the substrate but only paints it. In the next phase of work, this prevents the proper welding of the membrane to the substrate and, as a consequence, leads to a risk of losing bonding with the substrate. In comparison with the surface coated with the ordinary primer, the surface where C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS has been applied is covered perfectly and evenly and has a uniform black colour. Despite the fact that 3 to 4 coatings of the ordinary primer have been applied, the surface is not evenly covered and there are visible areas which have not been properly primed. Let's see how the application of C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS proved to be advantageous. From the very start of the experiment, a clear difference in the pace of work could be observed. Further on, this difference became larger. It is worth emphasizing that the conditions of the experiment were the same for both primers. The base layer was made of an ordinary base membrane. A temperature of 22 Celsius was maintained. Roofing rollers with the same bristle parameters were used, and additionally, the roofers had similar levels of experience, around 15 years. An important fact is that the longer time necessary for priming with an ordinary primer is due to the low quality of the priming result, which makes it necessary to apply several coatings. In contrast, in order to prime the surface with C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS, a single move of the roller is sufficient. If we switched the roofers, the results of the experiment would be the same. It would only depend on the properties of the particular primers. Let's sum up the first phase of the experiment, which was carried out under identical conditions for both primers, applied on a surface with an area of 15 square meters at a temperature of 22 degrees Celsius. The priming time for C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS was 6 minutes and 31 seconds, while the ordinary primer needed 11 minutes and 55 seconds, which means that priming with C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS is over 80% quicker. Let's compare the efficiency of both primers. In the experiment, we used a little under 3 kilograms of C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS and over 9 kilograms of the ordinary primer, which means that C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS has 200% better efficiency. The last parameter tested was drying time. C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS needed about 20 minutes, while it took over 3 hours for the ordinary primer to dry. This means around 700% quicker drying time for C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS. The next phase was a comparison of the application time of an extra ventilation top 5.2 Speed Syntan SBS membrane applied to a substrate primed with C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS with an ordinary flat membrane applied to a substrate primed with an ordinary primer. The same roofers took part in this phase of the experiment, and the same external conditions were maintained. Before starting the application of the membrane, the roofers unrolled the rolls on the deck. As we can see, from the very start, the application of the Speed Syntan SBS membrane was a much quicker process than is the case when using an ordinary torch-on flat membrane. The very quick pace of the roofing work is due to the exceptional properties of Speed Syntan SBS technology, which is based on the heat activation of the membranes. Heat activation means that a small amount of heat is delivered for a short period of time to the bitumen and the rubber adhesive strips located on the bottom surface of the roofing membrane. The bitumen and rubber strips melt and bond with the substrate. In contrast, the ordinary torch-on flat membrane needs large amounts of heat from a torch, which leads to a longer application time. Uncontrolled overheating of the membrane occurs frequently, which results in the destruction of the internal structure of the bitumen and the SBS, which negatively affects the declared life of the membrane. In contrast to the ordinary products, membranes with Speed Syntan SBS technology are fully protected against overheating due to the use of an indestructible Syntan layer, which, over the short period of time necessary for heat activation, is resistant to temperatures as high as 1000 degrees Celsius. The declared life of the membrane is not endangered. The use of specialized tools recommended by EcoPal, such as a guide and pressure rollers, small for crosswise and large for lengthwise overlaps, facilitates and speeds up the roofing work. Let's see what the application of a Speed Syntan SBS membrane and an ordinary torch-on flat membrane look like speeded up. Our roofers start the application at the same time. The surface covered with the Speed Syntan SBS membrane is 5 meters long, while the surface covered with the ordinary flat membrane is only 2 meters long. Speed Syntan SBS has already covered 10 meters. The surface where the ordinary membrane has been applied is approximately 3 meters long. Our roofing expert, working with the Speed Syntan SBS membrane, has finished his work and has applied 15 meters of the material. His colleague is still working. The surface covered by the ordinary flat membrane is a little below 5 meters. The experiment has clearly demonstrated that the application of a membrane with Speed Syntan technology shortens the application time by 70% when compared to the old-fashioned technology based on the application of an ordinary torch-on flat membrane. This result is due to the exceptional properties of the Speed Syntan SBS membrane, which requires less heat during the heat activation process. Additionally, due to the system of ventilation channels, an even distribution of heat over the whole bottom surface of the membrane is ensured. The indestructible Syntan layer, protecting against overheating of the bitumen coating, takes up the function of the quality guard, safeguarding the bond with the substrate. The additional factor, having an impact on the quality of the bond between the Speed Syntan SBS membrane and the substrate, is the application of the best primer available on the market, C-Plast Primer Speed Primer SBS, which is an integral element of the breakthrough technology of Speed SBSs designed and manufactured exclusively by EcoPal. Let's sum up the second phase of the experiment. 15 meters of the membrane with Speed Syntan SBS technology was applied in just 12 minutes and 16 seconds, while the application of an ordinary flat SBS membrane on the same area took 22 minutes. This second phase clearly demonstrated that the application of a membrane using the heat activation method is 70% quicker than the standard welding method. The experiment has clearly proved the advantages of the Speed Syntan SBS technology over the ordinary products and old-fashioned application methods at all stages of a roofer's work.